Featured guest, Doug Casey. At last count, he has visited almost 200 countries. In fact, he's written a book on international traveling and living. Doug is currently a venture capitalist and editor of the International Speculator. He's appeared on The Late Show with David Letterman, Regis Philbin, Charlie Rose, Merv Griffin, NBC News, and CNN. Doug has been kind enough to contact us all the way from South America. He's calling from Uruguay. So if you have any difficulty hearing, it's more than likely the nature of our connection here. Welcome back aboard, Doug.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it.
You know, I'd like to start off with the trouble we've had in the markets this year. Folks have blamed this, Doug, on hedge fund liquidations and panic selling and margin calls. Folks have used all types of explanations to explain the sharp pullback in crude oil, precious metals, and commodities. Do you think that this huge wave of selling is past the markets now?
It depends on our time perspective. The first thing I've got to say, as far as the reason that this is happening, is you can't blame it on hedge funds and brokers and people like that. They may be the immediate cause, but they're not the ultimate and important cause. The important cause of all this is the U.S. government and its policies. Of course, completely ridiculous and counterproductive that these people in Washington who are directly at fault in this are blaming others and now saying that they're going to try to solve it. So that's the first thing that I'd like to say. And the second thing is, I do think that the firestorm of selling is over for the moment, but I think the chances are excellent that it's over in the same way that it was over at the end of 1929, when the stock market fell something like 30% during a matter of a couple of months and then had a strong recovery. I think what we're in for is something that I've long called the Greater Depression. And we're still very early on in that. So you've got a rig for really, really stormy running over the next few years or more.
You know, Doug, it's funny you should mention the Greater Depression. We've termed it the Great Depression Part 2. When you look at the charts, I think your example is apropos, because we did have that huge slam down in 1929, and it brought in a fresh wave of people who were convinced, well, the bottom is here, and then the next wave down, and the next wave down, and it continued on, if memory serves, well into 1932. Dr. Martin Weiss is also a big proponent. He says that his father lived through the Great Depression, and he sees many similarities between now and then. Doug, I'd like to move on here, though. You've compared the current crisis unfolding in the U.S. with that of hyperinflation of Argentina in the past. Clearly, the credit crunch has put some of this inflationary concern on hold. It certainly caught me by surprise. When do you think that inflation will finally offset the mountain of credit destruction that we've seen here?
Well, that is a $64 question. The only thing that I feel very confident about is that the general standard of living in most of the Western world is going to fall significantly. That's a given. Now, that's the economic situation. The question that you're asking is, what will be the monetary situation? Inflation, deflation, or both of them in sequence? And that's what I think we're in for. We're in for a period of deflation as massive debts default and people scramble for cash and asset values are wiped out in the stock market and the real estate markets and so forth. But as the government stupidly bails out all these corporations and is printing up dollars by the trillions, we're going to be hit with a huge wave of inflation. In other words, the United States is acting exactly the way South American banana republic governments have for the last 100 years. And they're going to wind up destroying the currency and severely damaging the American economy. But it's much more serious what's going on in the United States and what's happened down here in Argentina or Uruguay, where the governments have sequentially, time after time, destroyed their currencies because the U.S. dollar is the world's currency. So this is going to be a worldwide phenomenon. But this is really, really serious.
It really is, Doug. With the Fed yesterday having cut rates by essentially 75 basis points, the lowest level since records have been kept. And the mainline media sources acted as though they were surprised. But, we've been watching the futures contract has been expecting this rate cut. Doesn't this bring up memories of the Bank of Japan's solution to its housing bust back in 1990? They've been holding rates artificially low, effectively in the 0 to half point range for many, many years. But unfortunately, the economy has not responded well. I mean, I guess you could say they avoided a Great Depression, but many folks refer to this past decade or so as the lost decade in Japan. Could the U.S. be facing a similar nightmare scenario here?
They could, but it's got to be much worse in the U.S. And the reason for that is this. It's that Japan, the average Japanese had significant assets, significant savings, and no debt. There was not a lot of Japanese yen outside of Japan. That's just the opposite of what we have in the U.S. There's huge debt within the U.S., and who knows how many dollars are outside the U.S. 6 trillion, 8 trillion, 10 trillion, nobody knows. And these things are all they're liabilities against the U.S. They're going to come storming back into the U.S. We've had an artificially high standard of living for the last 20 years, and we've been exporting paper dollars in return for all kinds of good things that foreigners sent us, Mercedes, Sony's, all these things. We give them paper, they give us real wealth. Now they've got all this paper, and it's going to come flowing back into the U.S., and the real wealth is going to be exported, and we get all of that paper back. So it's going to be much worse than what happened in Japan. But it's even worse than that, because, yes, the government's doing exactly what Japan did during the 90s, but not only bad, it's not just a stupid thing to do, it is the exact opposite. It's not just wrong, it's the exact opposite of what they should be doing. This depression has a life of its own, and the way you cure a depression